So thank you for joining me here at ODI in London. We're here to discuss ODI's new briefing, which is Cutting Europe's Lifeline to Coal. That's about the subsidies that 10 European governments are offering to the coal industry. And with me here is Shelagh Whitley, who's our lead researcher in this field of research. We'll be talking about the briefing, but if you'd like to ask us questions about it, please do ask us questions through Facebook. And if you're interested in this topic, also please share with your networks. So, Shelagh, before we get into the detail of this work, let's just set the scene a little bit. You've been interested in fossil fuels, in particular fossil fuel subsidies, for some time now. What got you interested in this field of research?
Yeah, so at ODI, we've been working on fossil fuel subsidies for about 4 years. I was brought into ODI to actually work on the topic of private climate finance. So
you came from the private sector, yeah?
Yeah, I came from the carbon markets, and I came to work on the topic of private climate finance, so trying to understand how investors can be incentivized to put money into addressing climate change around the world. And what we quickly found was that a lot of the incentives and tools that governments are using are focused on sort of centuries-old energy systems and fossil fuel energy rather than clean energy and the clean energy transition. And so we started to look at how do you look both at clean and green climate finance, but also the money that's going to oil, gas, and coal. And I guess the other sort of trigger for my research was work around the divestment movement, which kicked off, I guess, in around 2012, sort of around the same time, where activists were strongly calling for companies and individuals and businesses to pull their money out of fossil fuels. And what I thought, and what others in the team thought, was, well, yes, obviously you can take your money out of BP and Shell, but our governments probably have some role to play in this, and they do, as they're providing significant levels of fossil fuel subsidies, including those to coal that are covered in this research.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to dive into the European research in a little bit, but again, just tell us a little bit about the international backdrop to this. So the G20 have pledged to phase out fossil fuels, haven't they?
Yeah, so the G20 have pledged since 2009 every year to end fossil fuel subsidies. Recently, and quite encouragingly, the G7 have called for an end to fossil fuel subsidies and a 2025 deadline to end fossil fuel subsidies. And the reason we're looking at European governments in this case is that the EU has committed to end inefficient subsidies, harmful subsidies, including those to fossil fuels, and they actually have a 2020 deadline, which is right around the corner. Yeah.
So we're here talking about ODI's new research, looking at Europe's government and its subsidies to the coal industry. And with me here is Shelagh Whitley, our lead researcher on it. Shelagh, we've talked a bit about the international backdrop to the fact that there's been a lot of attention on private investors divesting from fossil fuels, but the need to focus on governments. So let's dive into this research a little bit more. And we should say the 10 European countries that you looked at. I've got a list here. They're on the front of our briefing. So the European countries you looked at are France, the Czech Republic, Germany, Greece, Italy, Hungary, the Netherlands, Poland, Spain, and the UK. So just give us a bit of a sense, what were the overall top-line findings that you came across?
Sure. So we looked at those 10 countries because they have the highest emissions from the energy sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We would have liked to look at all 27 European countries, but we couldn't because of the resources that we had for the research. So this is quite a representative sample. So even though it's only 10 countries, it really does represent a lot of Europe's greenhouse gas emissions from energy.
About 84%, you were saying.
Yeah.
Well, isn't it?
And so what we found was that across these governments, they're providing on average 6.3 billion a year in subsidies to coal mining and coal-fired power. I think what's important is to say that probably 6.3 billion is an underestimate because there's very little transparency in terms of information on fossil fuel subsidies, including information on coal subsidies. And there's also a couple of shocking findings, I guess, even though I guess 6.3 billion is a shocking finding in and of itself. 1 billion is going, that's sort of meant to go to the energy transition, is going to subsidies to coal, and almost 1 billion have been provided in new subsidies since the Paris climate talks.
So I want to go into those new figures in a little bit, but tell us first of all how you actually came about that big figure, the 6 billion in euros in subsidies. How do you actually find the detail to add up and arrive at that figure?
So we look at, there's some data sets for this. So although Europe hasn't renewed its own inventory of subsidies and hasn't done its own study since 2014, we do have information from some data sets, including those from the OECD, but we do a lot of digging. So we look at budget documents from different governments. We are really lucky that we have partners in all of the countries that we were studying. So we've also had these peer reviewed and for them to provide information on other subsidies that we couldn't find. So it's a combination of sort of desk-based research and working with partners in country to identify the subsidies. I guess I would say also that we take a very sort of conservative definition of subsidies for this paper, so we only look at direct spending by governments and tax breaks. Governments also provide subsidies through public finance, so publicly owned banks, and also through state-owned enterprises, and we didn't count that in this inventory.
So there's a lot of data detective work kind of going on, scouring through spreadsheets and so on. So I'm with Shelagh Whitley. We're talking about our new briefing paper on the subsidies, the lifeline to coal in Europe, government subsidies to coal. Shelagh, just thinking about who of that list of 10, are there countries that are doing well, that are moving rapidly to phase out the subsidies?
I guess, again, I think one of the things to say in terms of caveating the findings is that we have very little transparency. So part of the reason we've done this work is that really European governments themselves should be reporting on their trajectory and on their success in phasing out subsidies and meeting their existing commitments to phase out fossil fuel
there's
subsidies.
No way that they're doing that
at the moment. There's no system for accountability. So there's something called the European semester where European governments report on budgets. And up to 2015, they were meant to report on fossil fuel subsidies in that reporting, but they haven't done so. It's been taken out of the reporting requirements. So there's no, although European governments have these G20, G7, and European level commitments, there's no accountability mechanism. What we're hoping by putting this information out there, by putting it out country by country in national languages and in English, is that we'll start to show how this information can be reported so that governments start to do this more themselves.
So you're really trying to shine a light on actually the scale of subsidies, and that's the kind of value of this research. It's not out there in any kind of official form at the moment. So just to go back to that question, given all that and given what we know and what we can know from publicly available sources, who is doing well on this?
Yeah, so on the transparency, quickly, Germany does the best. They report on their subsidies every other year. And Italy is doing quite well. They've just done a new inventory of subsidies. In terms of the fossil fuel subsidy phase out or the coal subsidy phase out in Europe more specifically, what we find is quite different trends in terms of subsidies to coal mining and coal-fired power. So in terms of subsidies to coal mining, most governments are moving away from subsidizing coal mining. And that's because there's a European commitment to do that. So to end subsidies in particular to hard coal mining by next year, by 2018. So what we should see is a lot of subsidies to coal mining falling off next year, and that most of the subsidies now are sort of framed in terms of the fact that they're part of an ending to subsidies. So providing subsidies to end subsidies.
So in terms of Germany, which actually comes out quite badly in terms of the sheer amount of money that it is giving to the coal mining, coal industry, is that the picture there? Is that actually transiting out of it, or is it still pushing it into, into subsidies which are going to encourage the industry to carry on?
So Germany has a huge amount of subsidies. It's almost a third of the subsidies in our inventory are coal mining subsidies in Germany alone. They are the most transparent, but they also provide significant subsidies to the mining industry. Those are meant to end next year, so what we all hope is that we're all going to keep now a close eye on the fact that that actually takes place, because there's a commitment, but until we see zero, we don't know that it's been realized. I think what you see in Germany actually is they're lagging also in the coal-fired power subsidies. So they have introduced new subsidies, along with six or seven of the governments reviewed have put in place new subsidies. And Germany is trying to put in new subsidies at the moment for coal-fired power that are being investigated by the European Commission because there's not evidence of an actual need for those subsidies. So I think although we hope Germany will move ahead on coal mining, what we found is actually Germany is one of the only countries that hasn't committed to a coal-fired power phase-out, and they're trying to put new subsidies for coal-fired power in place now.
So definitely a mixed picture there. And of course they're the chair of the G20 this year as well. So we're talking about Shelagh Whitley and her colleagues' new new briefing on the subsidies in Europe to coal and the need to phase them out. We've talked a little bit about the background, the broad picture across European countries, transparency. We've talked a bit about Germany. Let's talk a little bit, since we're sitting here in London, what's the picture in the UK?
So in the UK, it's interesting. On the coal mining front, it was actually one of the only countries, I think, or the only country we found that actually seems to be providing coal mining subsidies that aren't linked to a transition away from subsidies. So there is some concern of existing and potentially, new coal mining subsidies in the UK. UK, like Germany and like many of other countries, has provided new subsidies to coal-fired power since the Paris Climate Agreement, which is very problematic. We even have found in the UK that some coal-fired power plants have received subsidies and they've never even been used, so they haven't come online or provided this backup power that they're meant to be providing. So it's really problematic, and I think in some ways the positive thing about the UK, although Germany has a lot of its own transparency, there's a lot of eyes of groups and actors in the UK who are paying close attention to what's going on with these capacity mechanisms, which are the fossil fuel subsidies, new fossil fuel subsidies that the UK government has put in place.
Okay, so I want to ask you about the capacity mechanisms in a little bit, but just to say, we're talking to Shelagh Whitley on our new briefing paper about European governments and their subsidies to coal. You can ask questions too through Facebook, and we've got one here. Georgia is asking, what are the subsidies being spent on?
So, as I said, the subsidies are divided between subsidies to coal mining and coal-fired power. So the coal mining subsidies either go directly to coal mining, so to support private companies that are engaged in coal mining. They also go to things like decommissioning and rehabilitation. So the dirty coal mining leaves waste and environmental damage, and instead of companies paying for those bills, which some would argue they should, governments are paying for the cleanup costs. There's also a very small amount of coal mining subsidies which go to support workers and communities to transition away from coal mining, and those are what we would think are sort of the subsidies that should continue. If there are subsidies to this sector, it should be to supporting workers and communities to transition away.
That's a tiny amount, actually, as you found.
Yes.
It's a very small proportion of the total subsidies being offered, those transition subsidies, yeah?
And then in terms of coal-fired power, there's a wide range of subsidies being provided. So that's all sorts of things from biomass co-firing. So when biomass and coal are used together, it's to coal-fired power plants themselves. It's through things like the European Emissions Trading Scheme, which in some countries is actually providing support to coal-fired power. And then there's these capacity mechanisms, which are sort of this idea that you pay coal to stay online when it might be needed, when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, to produce renewable energy.
So just wanted to ask you about that. You actually found that several hundred million euros went into new subsidies. That's even after the Paris Agreement to curb, global warming, even after all the European commitments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Why are these new subsidies going in?
It's a really good question, and it gets a bit technical and wonky, so just stop me. Basically, these subsidies are being put in place for a couple of reasons. So governments do it, they say it's for energy security, and they also say it's sort of to support the transition to renewables. So you have times where the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and you need to be able to turn on power very quickly. This is the argument that's made. And therefore, you need these coal plants sitting there on standby that can be deployed when this happens with renewables. This sort of thinking is sort of problematic for a few reasons. The first is that actually a lot of the demand forecasts are wrong. So there's often this overestimation of demand, which is why UK plants have been paid and never used. Actually, energy efficiency is increasing dramatically in Europe. And what that means is unless governments are keeping very close track, they'll estimate that we need way more power than we do. The other is that what they're really focused on is supply side, and not recognizing that actually what the power systems and our future power systems are about is about matching supply and demand. So you can have power use go down, and that can be paid for in the same way as power supply going up. And so they're really focused on coal-fired power backup, and not on things like battery and storage, on smart metering, on kind of flexible grids, and the things that we really need for the renewable transition.
So Another question coming in through Facebook Live. And if you want to ask questions, please do. We're in the last couple of minutes of the broadcast. What role does the EU have to play in all of this?
It's a really good question. So, we said, the EU has a commitment to end fossil fuel subsidies, including subsidies to coal. And one of the main, I guess there's a few areas that they can play a role. So in terms of the support to the just transition for workers and communities, they can encourage governments to provide that support. So if they're providing support to coal mining or coal-fired power, that's going to the communities that are going to be affected by the transition away. And there is discussion of using part of the EU emissions trading scheme revenues to create a just transition fund just for those purposes. So that if that proposal were taken forward, that would be very positive. As well, on the capacity mechanisms and these other instruments, European Commission has a role in saying, actually, we don't want that backup power shouldn't be coming from coal. And so there is a proposal to kind of have an emissions limit cap on what can go into those capacity mechanisms. So rather than having coal and diesel being provided as backup, you have sort of support for these kind of demand side response and other measures. And that's actually going to be discussed in the European Parliament in July. So there's a real opportunity to make that change now.
So just as we're in our last few minutes, I just wanted to ask, if we swoop away from Europe for a minute, there's huge speculation about the American administration and what they're going to do in terms of sticking to the Paris Agreement and so on. Now, whatever comes out of that, or if they do indeed withdraw or weaken their support for the Paris Agreement, how do you think that will impact on this field of work, which is the removal of coal and fossil fuel subsidies?
Well, I think there's a couple of major trends that are happening in the world, which is that all of the rest of the governments of the world are moving ahead on action on climate change. And therefore, although if the US leaves the Paris Agreement, it will be problematic, that's one country amongst hundreds that are moving towards action on climate change. I think also what you see, and it's impacting coal in the same way. A lot of these subsidies are sort of being provided, as we say, as the title, as a lifeline to coal. But there's a lot of other trends that are meaning that coal use is going down. That's lower price for renewables. That's also competition from gas and other sources. And as I said, competition from energy efficiency. And even in the US, states and cities and companies and businesses are moving ahead with all of these new transition technologies, which will mean that coal won't be able to compete, and should mean that even if the US withdraws from the Paris Agreement, that it won't have a sort of, I guess, catastrophic impact in terms of action on climate change.
That's brilliant, Shelagh. Thank you very much. And if you'd like to read Shelagh and her colleagues' research, please do go to odi.org. You can follow Shelagh on Twitter. Shelagh, give us your Twitter handle.
It's just my name. It's at Shelagh Whitley.
Or you can follow us on ODI Dev. If you'd like to sign up for more of these Facebook Lives, you can subscribe to live notifications. And last thing we should say, Shelagh, is the report is accompanied by 10 individual country briefings. So if you're watching from one of the countries which is covered, then you can get a specific country level briefing, much more detailed briefing about the situation in your country. So thanks very much to Shelagh, and thanks very much to you for tuning in. Thank you.